finish up the series on the presence of God, and this is kind of a follow-up to that series. It's a series called Fearless. Fear less. Fear less. Less fear. And why can we have less fear? Because God is with us. The presence of God. Not only with us, but He is in us. And so I'm going to take a look at just different aspects of fear. And here's a book. This is a Max Lucado book. So it's not like some, deep psychological examination. He's a pretty popular writer, popular style, but it's really good. I've gone back to this many times, so make that disclaimer that I am going to be sort of following his outline throughout the book. He just goes through different things that cause us to be afraid. Each chapter is something different. I'm not sure if I'll do all of those, but that's where we'll be going. So it's a book, it's Max Lucado, and it's called Fearless. It's an easy read, but it's really good. So today, this is kind of an introduction. And we're going to be looking at a very familiar passage, and it's a passage where Jesus asks his disciples, he says to them, "Why are you afraid?" Which is a very kind of penetrating question to be asked by Jesus, of all people. And so we'll be focusing on that. So I'm going to start with talking about Deb and I's, probably one of our most favorite TV shows, Monk. How many are familiar with Monk?
We are.
So Monk is this former detective, lives in San Francisco, who since childhood has just been racked with fears. He's a brilliant detective. He's just like a Sherlock Holmes. But he's also someone who's just consumed with fears. And there's one episode where he actually claims that he has 313 things that he is afraid of. And the reason he knows that is he keeps a list. So if he runs across something else that he finds that he's afraid of, he adds that to the list.
And he has them ranked, too.
Yes. This is what he's most afraid of. Well, the things he's most afraid of is germs. That's his number one fear. So he's got his assistant who carries wipes with him all the time. So anytime he shakes hands or anything, he's got to get a wipe. If he touches a tabletop or anything. So he is an example, even though he's fictional, of someone who is dominated and consumed by fear. It has just debilitated him in being able to live a normal life. So here's some of the things, and this is just a short list of some of the things that he is afraid of, that you can go on, just type in Monk's fears and you'll get the whole list. And they're all alphabetized. So number one, I said it's germs. That's his number one fear. But he's also afraid of needles. He's afraid of dentists. Well, that's not too uncommon. But he's also afraid of milk. He's afraid of snakes. That's not too uncommon. But he's also afraid of mushrooms. He's afraid of crowds. He's afraid of heights. He's afraid of elevators. He's afraid of ants. He's afraid of babies. He's afraid of birds. He's afraid of blenders. He's afraid of chalk. He's afraid of clouds and clowns. He's afraid of lint. He's afraid of glaciers. He lives in San Francisco.
That's pretty safe.
He's afraid of zoos, and he's afraid of zebras. So, needless to say, he lives a pretty miserable life, and he admits that. But he also, even though he knows he has all these fears, he pretty much is convinced that he can't do anything about it, that he's powerless over these fears. So, we don't want to be like, well, I don't think any of us are. I haven't met anybody quite that consumed by fear. But I think we all have our fears. We all have fears. Maybe we don't admit it to ourselves. Maybe we're not even aware of it till we encounter it. So what is a definition of fear? This is a Merriam-Webster. It's defined as an unpleasant emotion that's caused by the belief that someone or something is dangerous and likely to cause pain or is a threat. Well, that makes perfect sense. Something's going to hurt me, something that's going to threaten my life or bring harm to me. Of course, that is something that we would tend to want to avoid and be afraid of. Now, if you look up the psychological definition, they say similar thing. Fear is defined as a primal emotion that is triggered by a perceived danger or threat, whether real or imagined, leading to a physiological and emotional response. Heart beating, panicky feeling, break out in a sweat. And fear is a survival mechanism that prepares the body for actions such as fight or flight to protect itself from harm. Now, some of the synonyms for fear are helpful to look at. So, a synonym is dread. A synonym is horror, terror, panic, trepidation, anxiety, to fret, worry, stress. Those are synonyms. Now, it's helpful to look at what is the opposite, the antonyms of fear. Confidence, courage, assurance, brave, boldness, fearlessness. So when you look at those two lists of the synonyms and the antonyms, so is there anything in that list of synonyms that God desires for us, that God wants in our life? Obviously, the answer is no. But when you look at the opposite of fear, the antonyms, confidence, courage, and so on, those are things that are in the Bible that we are told to live like that. Be courageous. Put on the full armor of God. Stand against the foe.
Although I walk through the valley of shadow,
I will fear no evil. Yeah, that's a good example. So it's pretty clear, and that's what the assumption is from the Bible, is that God didn't design us for fear. He didn't design us to be controlled by fear. He designed us to live with confidence, with courage, and with boldness, fearlessness. So that's really important, but we've got to make the qualifier so that we understand that there actually is a healthy place for fear. Because fear is like, it's like a warning light on your dashboard, you know, that your engine's about to blow a head gasket, you know. That's a good thing to respond to. It lets us know that something is approaching us or is about to try to harm us so that we can take appropriate and protective action. Like you're getting really close to the edge of the roof of a 10-story building. Please don't step off. So that's a good kind of fear. The consequences of stepping off a high-rise building are pretty bad. Or like our niece, when she was small, came into the kitchen and said, we had the electric burners there that Debbie had just had on. Is that hot? Yeah, don't touch it. Bam! She puts her hand right on it. She didn't have a healthy fear, and the consequences were she got a pretty good burn.
Because she never had the experience of understanding why she had to be afraid.
Right, yeah. She had to prove it to herself,
Or at least wait for the answer before you test it.
But unhealthy fear is when we let that fear dominate and control us in ways that are not appropriate or beneficial or even protective to us. We think that it is, so we let that fear have its place because we think that somehow this is protecting us, but it doesn't even do that. It's actually very damaging to us. It inhibits, it restricts our ability to experience the real life, the abundant life that God has designed us for. And it's so harmful that of all of the imperatives that Jesus gave, all the commands that Jesus spoke, the most repeated one is the one that says, do not fear. 21 times in the Gospels, he says, do not fear. So, is it really possible to live a life free from this unhealthy kind of fear? Can we overcome fear? I mean, there's people that live lives convinced that this is just the way they are, and they can't overcome this fear. So, we're going to take a look, like I said, at a very familiar story and just try to answer that question. Is it possible to overcome fear, this unhealthy kind of fear? So that's the big question that Jesus asked his disciples in this story. Why are you afraid? So here it is, Mark 35 through 41, very familiar story. It says, on that day, when evening came, he said to them, let us go over to the other side. Underline that. Let us go over to the other side. Leaving the crowd, they took him along with them in the boat, just as he was, and other boats were with him. And there arose a fierce gale of wind, and the waves were breaking over the boat so much that the boat was already filling up. Jesus himself was in the stern, asleep on the cushion, and they woke him and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? And he got up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Hush, be still. And the wind died down and it became perfectly calm. And he said to them, why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith? They became very much afraid and said to one another, who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? So you first read that thing, and Jesus why are you afraid? Well, gosh, there's this storm. We're about to drown. Of course, it seems pretty logical kind of a way to feel at the time. Unless, or except for, Jesus. Jesus had absolutely no fear. How could he have no fear? What did he know that the disciples at this point hadn't learned and didn't know? That's the key. That's the key. Now, if you look at this story in the book of Matthew, Matthew uses a particular word for storm. And the word he uses is seismos, which means a great shaking. It's where we get our words for seismograph, seismologist, seismic, which, we associate that with what? Earthquakes. So this was a really big storm. So big of a storm that Peter and Andrew and James and John, who were all very experienced fishermen who had experienced many storms on the Sea of Galilee, were terrified, it says. They were terrified and thought they were going to die. But yet, where's Jesus? Where's Jesus? He is sound asleep. So when Jesus told him to get in the boat, we're going to go to the other side, do you think Jesus already knew that there was going to be a storm out in the middle of the lake before they got to the other side? Was aware of that? Yeah. So what does Jesus do? Well, that's a good time to take a nap, right?
Yeah.
That's a good time to crawl up there under the stern, which was the only kind of protective place on these little boats. And he took a nap, and he was sleeping so deeply that they had to wake him up in the middle of a seismic-sized storm. So it seems like Jesus he wasn't really all that concerned about the storm. He doesn't seem to be concerned that, like the disciples said, that they're perishing, that they're going to die. Why? Why could Jesus sleep so soundly in the middle of the storm? We were talking to David here, and he's been watching the house for the Vances, and he said the first few nights, it's like, I hear these sounds,
Yeah. And knowing here, who knows what it is?
Yeah. But here is this. I mean, I'm sure these guys are yelling. You got the wind going. You got it says the boat's filling up with water. So I'm imagining Jesus is getting soaked, but he's not even waking up. I mean,
That is a tired man. Yeah.
yeah, no kidding. But what did he know? Well, what he knew, and this is what he had been teaching, is that he was perfectly safe in his Father's care. He knew that not a thing outside of God's will for him was ever going to occur to him. And so he'd say, take a nap. And that's why I can say Jesus lived by faith. We often don't think of that about Jesus, that he lived by faith. He didn't see his Father. I mean, just as we can't see God, he didn't see him. But he had his promise. He knew his word. He knew what his purpose for being in this world was. And he'd say that so many times to people, my time has not yet come. So he kind of knew God had a timeline for him. And so he was trusting in his Father's love and care for him. He was living by faith. So obviously here, the disciples, they weren't living quite as deeply in that reality that Jesus was living in at this point. They're going to get there eventually, but at this point, they're not there yet. That's why they cry out at the end, "Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Now, Jesus had told them, they had heard at this point, I believe, the Sermon on the Mount, about your heavenly, take no thought for your life, you're of much more value than sparrows, and all of those things. And I'm sure they're nodding, going, amen, amen. But when it came to the crunch here, we see what their belief system really consisted of at that point. Which I think is why Jesus allowed this storm. This was a teachable moment. This is a teachable moment for the disciples. And so that's why he asked them, okay, why are you afraid? I'm not afraid. What are you afraid about? In fact, I think the impression you get is that you could have just done what I just did. You could have spoke to the waves if you had the faith that I have and said, be quiet. And he's the one that said, if you have faith as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, get up and, but they weren't there yet. They hadn't gotten there yet. So they were still living as most human beings do. They were living by their senses, by their sight, smell, touch. They're feeling the water and the waves, and that's a pretty powerful force to try to ignore. And so that's where they were still. And so the outcome of that was that they were terrified. They were terrified. They were walking by sight, not by faith in God. So what happens when that kind of fear dominates your life? Well, just using this as kind of a microcosmic kind of example, for the disciples, it reduced their confidence in God. In other words, it raised doubts about God. Here's what did they say to Jesus? Teacher, do you not care that we're perishing? Do you not care? So they're doubting Jesus' ability to protect them and take care of them in this situation. So that's one thing that fear does. It causes us to doubt. It causes us to question God's promises to me, God's love for me. It causes me to think that, well, maybe I've done something wrong. God's angry with me. He doesn't really care about me. Jesus knew different. He had no doubts about God's care and love for him, so he could sleep. But fear also makes us feel that God is not in control. The situation's chaotic. It's out of control. He says, we are perishing. Where's God? He's just going to let us die. And I'm sure they were thinking, Jesus, you're going to die too. If we go down, you're here, you're going down with us. And so they suddenly are not seeing Jesus as the one who rules the sea and the waves and is Lord over all things. And then fear also deadens our memory of how God has worked previously in our life. So think about the disciples at this point in the gospel. This is chapter 4 of Mark. So I just went back to the first chapter and just started going through to see, well, what had they seen so far? Well, they had seen a demon cast out of a man. They'd seen Peter's mother-in-law healed from a fever instantaneously. They had seen crowds come to Jesus and many be healed from diseases. They seen many demons cast out. They saw him put his hands on a leper and heal a leper. And they saw him heal a paralytic while he also forgave his sins. And they saw Jesus heal a man with a withered hand. But that all just seemed to kind of like be forgotten in this situation. That this man that was with them was powerful, very powerful. They didn't get up and say, Jesus, I think you could do something about this. They're always like, wake up, what are you doing? Sleeping, man, we're going to die. And then he speaks to the waves, and they're freaked out. I mean, they're shocked that happened. They didn't understand the extent to how powerful Jesus is, which is something we can do, not only to forget, but to underestimate what he can do. That's why we need to just have certain things right on the tip of our tongue, when we go into trial. First, that with God, all things are possible. To not underestimate what he can do. We don't want to put God in the box and say, well, this is kind of outside his ability. God is never going to look at you when you stand before him in heaven and say, are you crazy? You trusted me for that? You really believe that I could do that? God is never going to say that to us. He loves us to trust him. He loves us to put faith. I mean, as a parent, when my kids actually believed what I said and trusted me and, hurry up, get us there. I need water. I go, I don't have a fountain in the car, that was in the days before bottled water was a thing, and they just keep on going. I'm thirsty. I go, don't worry, I'm not going to let you die from thirst. So if they said, okay, Dad, I understand. I believe you. Man, I would have stopped the car, pulled over, taken a walk, and come back, and I'd have to recover from that. Really, you know what I'm talking about. So it's the same with God. I mean, that God wants us to trust him. I'm not talking about crazy stuff, but that he is going to take care of us. He is not going to ever, ever abandon us. And then fear just makes us feel terrible. It makes us feel bad. The disciples here, they're in a panic. They're terrified. They thought they were going to die. If you've ever been in a situation where you really thought you might die, I remember years ago, was at a camp when I lived up in Oregon, coming down from this camp, middle of winter, snows everywhere, we're going up, that's up in the mountains. We're coming down the mountain. There was 3 girls in the back and me and this guy in the front who was driving. And we're coming around the turn, and there was a pullout, and there was several people standing by a truck there. And this guy comes around and he starts to go into a slide, going right for this truck that's all these people, and they're split, scattering. And then he comes back and goes right toward the side of the mountain, and I'm in the passenger seat just looking at the that close. Then he comes back again before he gets that, and the girls in the back are they're screaming. I can never get them. And I kind of went and just kind of like, this was like a slow motion movie, you know. It's like, but you know, when you're there and you're just like, there goes my life in front of my eyes, you know. You know, that's not a good feeling. It feels terrible. So that's what fear does. It affects you not only spiritually and emotionally, but it actually, you know, affects you physically. And what it does, it smothers your peace. It robs you of joy, and it makes whatever situation you're in, however big it is, make it seem a lot worse. That the kind of unhealthy fear, it catastrophizes. That's a word. That's an actual word. Catastrophizing. That's what I did when I was in depression. Was, man, every little thing was just a catastrophe, and you're just dominated by that fear. And what that does, ultimately, what it does is it inhibits us from being able to grow in God's love, to know His love, to express His love to other people. It just kind of paralyzes us from being able to do that, because we're so concerned about ourselves. It's hard to care for other people. We're thinking about our own safety more than anything else. And actually, and he brings this out in this book, which I thought was something I never quite thought of it that way, but we make our personal safety become our God almost. That we orient our life around being safe. And I've always tended that way. I mean, I'm not the big risk taker, you know. I'm not going to be one that's going to jump out of an airplane, you know, with a parachute, or you know, even go on the crazy rides at a carnival or a fair or something. I've always kind of been, why? I don't want to hurt myself. Why should I? That's not fun. I might get hurt, you know.
Yeah.
So I'm sure I've missed out on many things, but I haven't broken a bone in my body so far. At least not what I'm aware of. Sorry, John. But that's because you don't have the fear tendency that I have.
It shows up in other ways.
Yeah, we all have fears, one way or another. So then there's Jesus. That's the point. When Jesus lived his life, he said things like, the things that I do, you're going to do even greater things. You're like, what? What? How is that possible? And we talk about becoming like Jesus. And one of the ways that we become like Jesus is we become less and less influenced and dominated by fear. So here's a few suggestions for what God's cure for fear is. And this is where it just piggybacks on with what we talked about before about the presence of God, is that one of God's main cures for fear is that he is with you. And not only with you, but he is in you. 1 John 4:4, you are from God, little children, and have overcome them, because greater is he who is in you than he who is in the world. And then to realize that fear is not from God. Not the healthy fear that God has built into us, but this unhealthy fear, the one we have problems with. 2 Timothy 1:7 says, for God has not given us a spirit of fear or timidity, but of power and love and discipline. So just to to remind ourselves when we find ourselves being sucked into the fear is that, hey, this is not from God. This is not from God. I don't have to accept it. I can resist it and overcome this through God's power, because this is not his will for me. This is not what he wants. And then another cure for fear is to realize that God's love for us is perfect and complete. 1 John 4:18 through 19. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, because fear involves punishment. And the one who fears is not perfected in love. We love because he first loved us. And that's, again, that fear involves punishment. Something bad's going to happen to us. And when we aren't convinced that God's love for us is perfect, that's kind of an ultimate fear. It's that ultimately God doesn't love me perfectly. That maybe he's going to punish me. He's going to do something bad to me. That's a horrible fear. And I've met a couple of people who have lived in that kind of a fear that they've committed the unpardonable sin, and could not convince them out of that. They were dominated by that fear that God was against them. We're going to look at that next week, I think, in the next message. So the takeaway from this message is that, first, we're not designed for fear. God did not make us to be fearful people. Fear is not his will for us. Second, that fear robs us of what God desires for us. Because what God wants for us is a life of faith, that's confidence in God, a life of love for God, love for people, a life of peace. It's that inner sense of, and assurance that really all is well, and hope, which is the anticipation of a future of unending joy with God. So we live in those things. We're never in danger of falling into the situation that Mr. Monk had, carrying around a long list of fears, that really are just crippling to a person's life. So it's important that we identify, are there fears? Are there things that are keeping me from being all that God wants me to be? Are there things that keeps me from fully loving God, from fully loving other people? There could be all kinds of things there. So the first step to overcoming them is to recognize them and then bring them before God, bring them before his light, his truth, and allow him to overcome the fears. It's that picture in John chapter 3 where those who are in darkness don't come to the light for fear that their deeds will be exposed. And so a lot of people are afraid to come to the light because, it's going to expose what they think they're afraid of. But that's where we need to be. So those who are in the light, come to the light to make sure that their deeds are from God. So next week we're going to look at that one particular fear, the fear that not too sure about God's love for me, not too sure how solid that is. That's a fear. I think a lot of people actually live with that fear, carry that around. So that's it.